With issues on Iran now, Israel and the United States continuing to escalate with the risk of a wider Middle East conflict growing. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu says Israel's military offensive against Iran is not done yet, insisting that the campaign is weakening Iran's clerical leadership. The war began on the 28th of February when Israel and the US launched strikes inside Iran that reportedly killed Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei just days before planned negotiations between Washington and Tehran. Iran has retaliated with missile and drone strikes across the region, while Saudi Arabia has condemned attacks on Gulf states, warning it reserves the right to respond. Some pundits, though, say Trump's war on Iran makes a mockery of American democracy. And this while French President Emmanuel Macron says it will take a lot more than missiles to defeat Iran. So the question we ask, does the war with Iran represent a democratic and constitutional crisis in U.S. foreign policy, driven by executive power, weak public support, and a lack of effective domestic opposition? Joining us now in the studio, Ayo Kimati, social architect, author, lecturer, and freedom fighter. A very good evening to you, and thank you for taking the time to speak to us. Let's just first start with what Benjamin Netanyahu is saying, that they are breaking the back of the Iranian clerical leadership. And based on what the U.S. has been saying and its justifications of the war, on the one hand, it's about Iran's nuclear capabilities, but it's been very clear that it is about supporting Benjamin Netanyahu. But I think the question is, I think I saw a figure saying something like 30% of Americans support the war on Iran. Isn't that a low base for a president to pursue a war that is effectively not his?
Yeah, the reality being in America, the vast majority of American citizens are against this war. And part of the reason is that people are becoming aware of the reality behind what's driving this war. Mm-hmm. It has nothing to do with U.S. interests. It's 100% driven by Jewish interests to control not only the Middle East, but they're moving into South America. They've taken over the executive branch of the United States of America. So when you look at when people say Donald Trump's war, the truth of it is Donald Trump at this point in time is a figurehead, a holding space for Jewish interests. The people who have paid him off, Marion Adelson, when we see who has bought his election and bought his positioning, if we look at who's actually making the decisions, Benjamin Netanyahu is making more decisions related to the military decisions of the United States of America than Donald Trump is. He's doing at this point what Jewish interests are driving, and that's Jewish interests in America and Jewish interests coming out of Israel.
And when we say Jewish interests, and this is actually what I'm thinking about, the popularity or lack thereof in Israel. I was listening to a professor from Israel who is part of an organization against the building of human settlements, basically saying that, people in Israel are kind of accustomed to war. They seem not to be bothered with whether or not they are at war with Iran. But I thought, as I was listening to him, the most important thing is, hasn't this achieved the purpose of obfuscating the war on Gaza?
I think if we look at it in a broader context, we'll understand that what we talk about is not actually what's happening. In 1948, when they came, they weren't invited. This is not even the land that they're supposed to be in. So what we're actually looking at is Jews having taken a region close to the full extermination of the Palestinian people. Mm-hmm. And now they're looking Lebanon, Syria, and now they're moving towards Iran, an extermination of the people in that region. So, yes, it's overtaken the discussion, but if we look at it from the perspective of Jewish interests, they don't separate them. Anybody that's not Jewish in that region, they want them gone. So for them, the destruction of the Palestinian state and the destruction of the Iranian state and the Syrian state and the Libyan state and all of those Muslim states in that region are all part of the same objective of Jewish hegemony.
I mean, I can imagine anybody who is pro-Israel who is Jewish would be objecting to your statement right now, saying when you say Jews, you are, conflating identity as opposed to what some may say is also Netanyahu's war, that this is somebody who faces imprisonment, who really is pretty much on his way out, that he doesn't have the popular support. So, and Israel often argues that countries like Iran, its war with Hezbollah, which has now pretty much joined the war with Iran, is because they're against Israeli nationhood, statehood. So what is your response to that?
My response is it's true that they would say that, but the reality of it is that Netanyahu did not create the state of Israel and take it from the Palestinians in the beginning. He's not the one who did the Nakba. So what we do is, from one Israeli terrorist to the next, we obfuscate it to just being an individual effort. It's not an individual effort. There's a collective Jewish interest. When apartheid was in South Africa, if you look at how is this government able to oppress and suppress this many African people, what was the nation giving them the support? It was Israel. It was the ones that were supporting the apartheid state in this country, which is why the brothers and sisters in South Africa have such a good relationship with the Palestinians, because Arafat and the PLO were supporting the fight against apartheid. What we're looking at is, again, it's their Jewish interests, and it's hard for them to debate now because the world is waking up to it. How do you have Mexico that has 1 out of every 10,000 people is Jewish, and then a Jewish woman walks in as president with no precedent of her in politics in that region? How does this happen? How do you get fires waging throughout Chile, fires waging throughout Argentina, and now when they look in and find out who's doing it, you find Jewish interests? How do you have fires?
Or define that when you say Jewish interests. And I also want to look that against the backdrop of Zionism as a political construct.
Okay. So Zionism is a fancy word to use to hide who's doing it. So what Jews tend to do, they make a lot of different terms. Feminism, if you look at who's driving it, is Jewish. If you talk about media control and censorship, if you look at who's behind it, it's Jews that are doing it. Why? Because it's usually someone that's talking about their control and domination in banking. When you talk about that, they create different terms for it. When we talk about Zionism, the only thing we're talking about is Jews saying we have a right to steal other people's land and God gave it to us. And in order to do that, we're going to pigeonhole the United States of America and their military and use them as the battering ram to go and murder people that we don't have the power to go and murder.
And when you say that, are you talking about what is happening in Iran at the moment?
I'm talking about what's happening in Iran, what's happening in Palestine, even what's happening in America. Like, I live in the United States of America. The most popular conversation in the United States of America right now, I know because I live there, is what are we going to do about the Jewish overthrow of the United States of America? People look on television. I talk to people in South Africa every day. I talk to the cab drivers and talk to the people on the street, and they're like, oh, America's doing wonderful. And I'm like, so you all aren't aware. The level of drug addiction, the level of poverty, the level of homelessness in the United States of America right now is something I've never seen in my life. It's all driven by Jewish interests. Black communities, people's homes are being taken.
What do you mean? Maybe quantify that by saying, and I don't want to get too waylaid because we are talking about the war on Iran, and I want to talk about, because what Israel argues is their right to exist, and in the same case, I want to juxtapose that against Iran's right to exist according to international law.
Again, we use the words international law. There's nothing that relates to international law that is Israel, if you want to call it Israel, or the Jews are following. None of the laws of international law will allow for the U.S. on behalf of Israel to go in and take somebody out in Venezuela who just made the statement that what the Jews are doing in Israel is terrorism. And now all of a sudden you take him and remove him from it. There's no basis in international law. There's no international law that allows you, what the Jews are doing in Israel, to take weapons to the skyscrapers of citizens. And I saw children playing soccer. You call it football. And they just bombed them while they were playing football. It's against international law. But really, international law only applies when there's execution. Meaning, in other words, if you're not going to do anything, so you say there's a law. If nobody comes in and enforces it, if there's no enforcement, then there's no law. There's nothing that's turning.
But shouldn't the global community also take responsibility? And I'm talking also about in the United States, about a lack of anti-war movement around coagulation over such a cause. And it's all very well and good to say it's because all has been done because of Jewish interests. But isn't that also a factor?
Well, that's a huge factor. Here's the problem. You get the head of a nation who should have the right to say, what's happening in Israel is genocide. We saw that in Venezuela, Maduro. And then what happens? The Jews tell Donald Trump, not just the Jews in Israel, but the Jews in America, go and get this man out of office. And you take an elected official out. So what happens is, I'm not saying that people should not have an anti-war thing, but what's happening now, if a leader of a nation will get taken out because they say we're against what you're doing to people, then people are free to say something. South Africa is the first nation to come out and say something about it. And people were surprised at South Africa. I was very proud to see South Africa do that. But the truth of it is, people are concerned with the decisions that the U.S. is making on behalf of Jews right now. What happens if I speak out and say what my opinion is?
But the thing is, and I keep going to, so when we talk about Jewish interests, can we please quantify it so that we're not just, whitewashing everything with Jewish interests? Sure. What exactly are we pointing to practically? And also, Israel argues that Iran's nuclear capabilities is actually what makes it feel threatened as a state. And we, as I mentioned earlier on in the introduction, that Saudi Arabia is now also, and Iran says obviously it's doing what it's doing to protect itself as a state, and that international law does say it is, entitled to do so. It is entitled to take military force to defend itself. Saudi Arabia is warning Iran against doing that. But the point I'm making is that it seems that there is convergence at some level on the legitimacy of the war.
It's completely, none of it is legitimate based on, if we want to quantify it. John F. Kennedy said, no, Israel, you cannot have nuclear weapons. So Israel's not supposed to have nuclear weapons. How did they get them? They murdered John F. Kennedy. They murdered John F. Kennedy. And then we have individuals who gave secrets, U.S. military secrets and nuclear secrets to Israel, and they developed nuclear warheads. So they have these, and it's illegal, and they're the only ones that have not allowed any inspectors in to look in their country and see what they have. But then they tell other nations who they're attacking, like Iran, who Benjamin Netanyahu in the 1990s was saying Iraq was the problem, said they had weapons of mass destruction, got the U.S. to go in and murder these people, murder the head of state, lynched him, hanged him from a noose, and then said, oops, we made a mistake. They didn't have weapons of mass destruction. The same thing they're saying with Iran now. For 20-something years, Iran has said we have no interest because our religious belief system say we don't want a nuclear weapon. And yet they've now convinced Donald Trump, who's now just a tool on behalf of Jewish interests. Now, you said, let's quantify it. Mm-hmm. When we had the last president, he came in office. Every single member on his cabinet, which is not elected, these are not elected. When you have the U.S. executive branch, the president comes in, and then he elects his executive branch. You look from Walensky to Zients, you look down the list, who Biden had on his cabinet, all Jewish. I have a page in my book, Jews Are the Problem. When you go down the list, we've never seen anything like this ever in the history of the United States of America, where you have less than 2% of the population, and they're like 80% of the important positions on a cabinet. None of them are elected by the American people.
But isn't it rather a pattern of executive war powers expansion, the abuse of power by, and the U.S. President Donald Trump, in his first tenure, there was accusations of that. He's doing that now. So isn't it a point of the weakness of democratic institutions in the United States? And it's one thing saying Jews are the problem. And, as an academic yourself, surely there must be literature that goes beyond Jews are the problem.
Once everyone who's read the book around the world, my book has gone around the world. We have it in China now. When people read the book, and this is an interesting phenomena, people have heard Zionism. They've heard the different words, but they've never quantified it to look at it in the aggregate to say, wow, each of these issues that we see occurring internationally all stem from one common source. So when you say Zionism, somehow we forget that all Zionists are Jews. It's just Jews that have a political objective. When you look at apartheid, when you look at who was really controlling apartheid and supporting this apartheid system, it was Jews. Even when you look right now, we're in South Africa. I'm talking to people on a regular basis about what's happening in the Western Cape. You have Jews publicly flooding the Western Cape, raising the prices of property, and then saying this is going to be our new homeland.
But it still takes me to the point that I'm making, that, you know, it sounds more like hate speech, like anti-Jew sentiment, as opposed to, this is why I'm saying, you say you've written a book about what is the basis of that, what is in the literature, what does it point to, and I really am just doing my best to have a constructive conversation about the war in Iran. So let's talk about that. You keep saying Jewish influence, but as I say, Americans surely cannot blame Israel for its weak democratic institutions. These are people who voted for U.S. President Donald Trump, unless you're saying it is because of vote stuffing by the Jewish nation. Do you understand what I'm saying? Let's talk about things that are tangible, that we can point to, where there is, you know, ample literature on.
Tangible. Again, I wrote a book on, the whole book is tangible, but let's talk about tangible, like you're talking about how Donald Trump in office. Right now in the United States of America, you have one person in all of Congress who came out and said they have what they call the AIPAC person, meaning AIPAC, the American Israel, it's really a political action committee, but they call it public affairs committee, that buys U.S. politicians. And he says, they can't buy me. One person, Thomas Massey, one person in all of Congress who told the American public, yeah, AIPAC comes in and says, we're going to buy you. And if you don't do what we want you to do, then you're not going to get elected.
All right. Let's talk about Iran's clerical leadership, the importance thereof. And I'm talking about the existence of the state of Iran and its continuation. We have seen Ayatollah Khamenei's son, Mujtaba, now taking over the questions about him. He's a relative unknown, so many are saying. And a lot of the objection to Iran's leadership has been on the religious ideologies that has been espoused. So let's look at that leadership. Is there anything that is likely to change? What would be important? What is strategic about his choice as a leader?
I think that what Iran is faced with now, they've been trying to, as much as possible, avoid massive warfare, direct kinetic warfare with Israel and the United States of America. They're less concerned about direct war with Israel. They're more concerned with the United States of America. But at this point, the United States of America is a tool of Israel. So what Iran is faced with now is, before they had people like Ayatollah Khamenei who were adverse to nuclear weapons. Now that Israel and the United States of America, which is really Jewish interests, is the best way to say it because it's the truth, they've killed the top leadership and then many of the people in the top leadership. So now the people who were more conservative are gone. Now you have people who they've murdered their family members, they've murdered their leadership, and now you have religious leadership that's less religious. There's still a religious leadership, but now they're more practical, saying, if we don't do something, there's no talking. Every time we've gone to these talks and discussions, when we say, hey, we're going to agree not to do anything nuclear, right when we're in a discussion, then they bomb us and kill us. So there's no way that they're letting us out of this. We have to fight. And so they're becoming more militant, which is part of what Israel wants, because they want a justification for nuclear warfare in Iran.
And the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, its strategic importance in Iranian politics and the future, because the question is being raised now. So just how far regional can this war go? Listening to President Lula da Silva of Brazil speaking to President Ramaphosa, he gave an address earlier on saying that it's time that South Africa starts thinking about its defense, beefing up its military capability in case it gets invaded. So the question really is just how far wide the impact of this war?
That's an excellent question. And it goes to what you were saying before. The problem with this war, now that Iran sees that it has to fight this way, China has interests in Iran. Russia has interests in Iran. The AES has interests in Iran. So you have Africa having interests in not seeing Iran fall. Russia has interests in not seeing Iran fall. China has interests in not seeing Iran fall. So we're looking at literally the potential if the U.S. and Israel launch nuclear weapons in Iran, it is very probable that Russia will intercede, Pakistan will intercede, and we're starting to look at international nuclear war of cataclysmic proportion.
All right. Thank you so much for joining us, Ali Khamenei, speaking to us about the latest developments on Iran. As we mentioned earlier, in Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu saying that really they are breaking the very architecture of Iran's clerical leadership. This, as US President Donald Trump says, any day now the war is going to end. But questions are being asked if this is really the reality. Is Iran scaling back? Is it doing so out of some sort of a backdoor agreement? Iran has said no, that it will continue to defend itself, and of course we continue to watch the space as well. Ali Khamenei is a social architect, author, lecturer and freedom fighter. Brings the time to 17 minutes to 10. You're listening to Africa World Hour.